A little boy ran into the Vampire King's throne room crying, "They took my mom!" Wait, before the next revelation happens, if this mystery has already captivated you, let us know where you're following this story from. To make sure you don't miss any unexpected alliances or awakened powers, subscribe and join our circle. The game is about to change. Now, back to the scene. The boy collapsed on the polished black marble floor, his small body heaving with sobs, his worn clothes torn and dirty. Behind him, the palace guards rushed forward, their faces pale with terror, not at the child, but at what they had failed to prevent. No mortal had breached these doors in 3 centuries. No living thing had dared disturb the Vampire King during his evening council. And yet, here was this child, this impossible, fragile human child, sprawled at the foot of the dais where Victor Draven, the immortal ruler of the Northern Territories, sat upon his throne, of bones and silver. The throne room fell into a silence so complete that the boy's ragged breathing echoed off the vaulted ceiling like the whisper of ghosts. 30 vampires, lords and ladies of the ancient bloodlines, stood frozen along the stone pillars that lined the hall, their crimson eyes fixed on the small intruder, their predatory instincts barely restrained by centuries of discipline and the overwhelming presence of their king. Victor himself did not move. He remained perfectly still, one pale hand resting on the arm of his throne, his dark eyes studying the child with an intensity that would have reduced most men to ash. He was a figure carved from shadow and moonlight, tall, angular, devastatingly beautiful in the way that death is beautiful. His black hair fell past his shoulders, and he wore the darkness of his court like other men wore crowns. "Guards!" His voice cut through the silence like a blade, soft and deadly. "Explain." The captain of the guard, a vampire named Makai, who had served the throne for 200 years, stepped forward. His silver armor gleamed in the light of 1,000 candles that lined the hall, but his confidence had evaporated. "Your Majesty, we don't know how the Eastern Gate was sealed, the wards were intact, we had sentries at every—" Silence. Victor's word was a whisper, but it carried the weight of absolute power. The boy had stopped crying. He pushed himself up onto his knees, his small hands pressed against the cold marble, and looked up at the Vampire King. His eyes, impossibly blue, like summer sky that vampires could no longer see, met Victor's without flinching. "Please," the child said, his voice hoarse but steady now. "They took her, the men with the crosses and fire. They said she helped your kind. They called her a blood whore. They're going to burn her at dawn." A ripple of reaction moved through the assembled vampires, whispers in a dozen dead languages. The hunters had grown bold indeed if they were moving against civilians now. Victor leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees, his fingers steepled before his face. "What is your name, child?" "Thomas." The boy wiped his nose on his sleeve. "Thomas Calloway. My mom is Elara Calloway. She works at the inn. She gives food to the pale folk sometimes, when they're hungry. She says everyone deserves kindness." "The pale folk," Victor repeated, and something that might have been amusement flickered across his face. "Is that what she calls us?" "Yes, sir, Your Majesty. Your—" Darkness? Thomas stumbled over the proper address, his courage beginning to falter now that the immediate crisis of breaking in was over. "And why," Victor continued, his voice dropping even lower, "would I care what happens to one mortal woman who is foolish enough to show kindness to monsters? The question hung in the air like a knife. Several of the court vampires smiled, anticipating the child's fear. They had not fed yet this evening, and the scent of his blood was intoxicating, young, pure, untainted by vice or age. But Thomas did not run. Instead, he reached into his torn shirt and pulled out something that made every vampire in the room go utterly still. It was a silver medallion on a broken chain. The metal was old, tarnished, but the symbol engraved on its surface was unmistakable. A rose wrapped around a crescent moon, the seal of House Draven. Victor was standing before anyone saw him move. He descended the dais in 3 fluid strides and knelt before the boy, his hand outstretched. "Where did you get this?" "Mom said someone gave it to her, a long time ago, before I was born." Thomas placed the medallion in Victor's pale hand. "She said if we were ever in real trouble, to bring it to the Black Castle. She said you owed her a debt." Victor's fingers closed around the silver. For a moment, just a heartbeat, his expression cracked. Memory, raw and unexpected, flooded his ancient eyes. He saw a different time, a different era. A young woman with dark hair and frightened eyes, kneeling in the ruins of her village. The plague had taken everyone she loved. The hunters had blamed the vampires. And Victor, passing through on a night when his soul felt particularly heavy with the weight of centuries, had stopped. He had given her food, gold, protection for her journey to the next town. And when she had thanked him, weeping, he had removed his medallion and pressed it into her hands. "If you ever need aid, bring this to my court." A debt unpaid is a burden even to immortals. He had forgotten. Gods help him. In 300 years of war and politics and blood, he had forgotten one act of mercy. "Ilara Calloway," Victor said quietly. He looked up at his captain. "Mikhail, how many hunters?" "Your Majesty, we have reports of a purge squadron in the Eastern Valley, 20 men, led by Father Benedict." A name that made several vampires hiss with hatred. Father Benedict was a zealot, a madman who believed that any human who consorted with vampires was as guilty as the creatures themselves. He had burned villages, slaughtered families, all in the name of his twisted faith. Victor rose to his feet, the medallion still clutched in his hand. When he spoke, his voice carried through the throne room with the force of a winter storm. "Assemble the Blood Guard, full armor. We ride within the hour." "Your Majesty?" Lady Serena, one of the elder vampires, stepped forward. "You cannot mean to go yourself. For one mortal woman. It could be a trap." Victor turned to her, and the look in his eyes made even the ancient vampire step back. "I have made precious few promises in my long existence, Serena, but I keep the ones I make. This child came to me in faith, holding my own seal. I will not dishonor that courage with cowardice." He looked down at Thomas. "You will remain here. You will be given food, a bed, and protection. Do you understand?" "I want to come," Thomas said immediately. "She's my mom. I have to." "No." Victor's word was final. "You have done enough. You breached my castle, interrupted my counsel, and reminded me that debts matter. Now you will trust me to do what I do best." "What's that?" Thomas asked, his voice small. Victor's smile was terrible and beautiful. "Hunt." The Eastern Valley was 3 hours' ride at mortal speed, but the Blood Guard did not ride as mortals did. They were shadows on horseback, moving through the night like smoke, their armor black as the void between stars. 20 vampires, each one worth 100 human soldiers, led by their king. Victor rode at the front, his cloak billowing behind him like wings. Beside him rode Mikhail and Lady Serena. He had insisted she come, both as punishment for her objection and because her gift for illusion might prove useful. Behind them, the guard maintained perfect formation, silent as the grave. They reached the edge of the hunter encampment just before midnight. Victor raised one hand, and the entire company stopped as one, dismounting without a sound. Through the trees, they could see the glow of fires, hear the rough voices of men. And there, in the center of the camp, tied to a wooden stake atop a pile of unlit kindling, was a woman. Ilara Calloway was perhaps 30 years old, though hardship had aged her. Her dark hair hung loose around her face, and her simple dress was torn and dirty. But her eyes, the same impossible blue as her son's, burned with defiant fury as Father Benedict circled her, his Bible in one hand, a torch in the other. "Do you repent?" the priest demanded, his voice carrying through the camp. "Do you renounce your crimes against God and nature?" "I gave food to people who were hungry," Ilara said, her voice steady despite her terror. "If that's a crime, then your God is a monster." Benedict's hand cracked across her face. "Blasphemy! You lie with demons. You corrupt the natural order. At dawn you will burn, and your ashes will serve as a warning to—" He never finished the sentence. Victor stepped out of the shadows at the edge of the firelight, and the entire camp erupted into chaos. "Vampires!" The hunters scrambled for their weapons, crossbows, silver blades, vials of holy water. But the blood guard was faster. They poured into the camp like a dark tide, moving with the precision of a predator pack. Steel clashed against silver. Screams tore through the night. Victor walked calmly through the center of the chaos, making his way directly toward Father Benedict. Crossbow bolts shattered against an invisible shield of force surrounding him, one of Serena's illusions. A hunter swung a blessed sword at his head. Victor caught the blade in his bare hand, wrenched it away, and threw the man into a tent hard enough to collapse the entire structure. "Father Benedict," Victor said pleasantly, as if they were meeting at a garden party, "we need to discuss your definition of heresy." The priest stumbled backward, his torch shaking in his hand. Up close, Victor could see the madness in his eyes, the kind of zealotry that came from fear, not faith. "Demon," Benedict hissed, "hell-spawn! You cannot touch me. I am protected by—" Victor moved faster than human eyes could follow. One moment he was 10 feet away, the next his hand was around Benedict's throat, lifting the priest off the ground as easily as a child lifting a doll. "By what?" Victor asked softly. "Your God? Your faith? Or perhaps by the fact that you prey on the weak and defenseless and have never actually faced one of us in combat?" Benedict tried to speak, but Victor's grip was too tight. Behind them, the sounds of battle were already fading. The blood guard had neutralized the hunters with ruthless efficiency. Most were unconscious, a few were dead, none were still fighting. "Here is what will happen," Victor continued, his voice as cold as winter stone. "You will write a full confession of your crimes. You will name every innocent you have murdered in your crusade, and then you will spend the rest of your mortal life in a cell, contemplating the difference between justice and murder. Does this plan suit you?" He loosened his grip just enough for Benedict to gasp. You cannot. The church will—" "The church will do nothing," Victor interrupted, "because I will send them your confession along with evidence of your atrocities." "Even zealots have standards, Benedict. You crossed them long ago." He dropped the priest in the dirt and turned to Mikkel. "Take him, bind him with silver, let him feel what his victims felt." Then Victor walked to the stake where Ilara was tied. She watched him approach, her eyes wide but unafraid. Up close, he could see the scars on her hands, the marks of a hard life, of work and sacrifice. He could also see the bruises on her face, the blood on her lip. "Ilara Calloway," he said quietly, drawing a blade from his belt. She flinched, just slightly. "I should have remembered you," Victor continued, cutting through her bonds with 2 swift strokes. 300 years, and still I should have remembered. The woman who thanked me for mercy she should never have needed to beg for." The ropes fell away. Ilara stumbled, and Victor caught her arm, steadying her. For a moment, they stood there in the firelight, the immortal king and the mortal woman, while around them the blood guard efficiently dismantled the hunter camp. "My son," Ilara said, her voice cracking. "Thomas, is he—" "Safe," Victor assured her, "eating sweets in my kitchen and probably terrorizing my servants with questions. He is quite possibly the bravest child I have ever encountered." Ilara's knees buckled with relief. Victor caught her, lifting her into his arms without effort. "Come," he said gently, "let us take you home." They rode back to the castle with Ilara seated before Victor on his horse, wrapped in his cloak. She said nothing for the first hour, too exhausted and overwhelmed. But as the black towers of Castle Draven came into view against the starlit sky, she finally spoke. "Why did you come? Truly?" Victor was quiet for a long moment. "Because your son held up a piece of silver and reminded me of who I was before I became this." He gestured at himself, at the armor and power. "Before I became the Vampire King. When I was simply Victor, trying to do one decent thing in a world that had forgotten decency." "And who are you now?" Ilara asked. "That," Victor said, "is what I am attempting to remember." The castle gates opened before them. In the courtyard, Thomas stood waiting, held back by 2 patient guards. The moment he saw his mother, he broke free and ran to them, crying again, but this time with joy. Victor dismounted first, then helped Ilara down. She immediately dropped to her knees, pulling Thomas into her arms, both of them sobbing and laughing at once. The guards, the vampires, even Lady Serena watched in silence. After several minutes, Ilara stood, keeping Thomas close. She approached Victor, who had been giving orders to Mikhail about the prisoners. When she touched his arm, he turned, surprised. "Thank you," she said, simply. "You owed me nothing," Victor replied. "The debt was mine." "Then let me propose a new arrangement." Ilara straightened her shoulders, though she barely came to his chest in height. "You saved my life, my son's life. I would repay that. I am a healer. I know herbs, remedies, how to tend wounds. Let me work in your castle. Let me be useful." Victor frowned. "This is no place for mortals. It is cold, dark, filled with creatures who apparently honor their debts, who ride into danger for strangers, who could have drained my son dry, but instead gave him sweets." She smiled, tired but genuine. "I have lived among humans who called themselves righteous while burning women alive. I will take my chances with honest monsters." A laugh, actual, genuine laughter, escaped Victor's lips. Several vampires turned to stare, shocked. Their king did not laugh.
"You are either very brave or very mad, Ilara Calloway. Perhaps both." She glanced down at Thomas, who was nodding eagerly.
"What do you say, Your Majesty? Do you have room for a healer and her impossible son?" Victor looked at them both. This woman who had survived so much. This child who had dared the impossible. And for the first time in decades, perhaps centuries, he felt something shift in his chest. Not his heart, that had stopped beating long ago, but something else, something that might have been hope. "Very well," he said, "but there will be rules. Thomas will have tutors. You will have guards. And neither of you will ever, under any circumstances, enter the throne room unannounced again." Thomas grinned. "Can I explore the castle?" "Under supervision." "Can I learn about vampires?" "If you study your letters as well." "Can I—" "That is quite enough questions for one evening," Victor said, but his tone was indulgent. He looked at Mikhail. "Show them to the Eastern Tower, the rooms with sunlight. Have the kitchens send up food, real food, not what we consume. And have the healers check them both for injuries." "At once, Your Majesty." As the guards led Ilara and Thomas away, the boy turned back one last time. "Thank you, King Victor," he called out. "You're the best monster ever!" The words echoed through the courtyard. Lady Serena appeared at Victor's side, her expression unreadable. "This is dangerous," she said quietly. "Mortals in the castle, the boy especially. He is young, curious. The blood scent will be controlled," Victor said firmly. "I will make it law. They are under my protection. Any vampire who harms them will answer to me personally. You risk much for two humans." Victor turned to face her, and his eyes held centuries of weight. "I have spent 300 years being feared, Serena, respected, obeyed without question, and I have been utterly, completely alone." He looked up at the tower where a light had just flickered on. Ilara and Thomas's new home. "Perhaps it is time I risked something for the chance to remember what it feels like to be more than a monster." Serena studied him for a long moment, then inclined her head. "As you command, my king." She left him there in the courtyard, standing in the darkness, looking up at the castle that had been his prison and throne for longer than most kingdoms had existed. And for the first time in memory, Victor Draven wondered if perhaps his story was not quite finished after all. 3 months passed, and Castle Draven changed in ways both subtle and profound. Thomas Calloway became a fixture in the castle's daily life, a small bright presence in halls that had known only shadow for centuries. He attended lessons with Elder Cassius, a vampire so ancient he remembered the Roman Empire, who discovered that teaching a curious child was far more engaging than the political maneuvering of court. The boy learned letters and numbers, history and languages, but also the real history, the one written by vampires, the one that told both sides of the eternal war. Ilara established a healing room in the eastern wing where she treated the minor ailments of the castle's few human servants, and, surprisingly, several vampires who discovered that even immortal bodies could suffer from poorly healed wounds that had festered for decades. She asked no questions about their nature, showed no fear, and worked with the same steady competence she had shown at the inn. Victor found himself spending more time in the Eastern Wing than he ever had before. He told himself it was merely to check on his guests, to ensure they were adjusting properly, but the truth, a truth he barely admitted even to himself, was that he was drawn to their presence.
to the sound of Thomas's laughter echoing through stone halls, to the quiet conversations he had with Ilara in the healing room, discussing everything from herbal remedies to philosophy. It was during one of these conversations that everything changed again. Victor had come to the healing room late one evening to discuss increasing the security patrols. There had been reports of hunter activity in the neighboring valley. He found Ilara alone, grinding herbs by candlelight. Thomas was asleep in their quarters upstairs. "You work late," Victor observed, settling into a chair near her workbench. In 3 months, he had become comfortable enough to do that, to simply sit, without formality, without his throne and crown. "So do you," Ilara replied, not looking up from her mortar and pestle. "I've noticed you rarely sleep. Vampires don't require much rest." "That's not the same as not needing it." She finally looked at him, her blue eyes sharp. "When did you last truly rest, Victor? Not just close your eyes, but actually let go of the weight you carry." The question surprised him with its directness. Ilara had grown bolder in the months since her rescue, more confident in speaking her mind. Victor found he liked it. "I am a king," he said simply. "The weight is the crown. The crown is a piece of metal. The weight is your choice." Ilara set down her tools and turned fully toward him. "You saved my life. You gave us a home. You've been kinder to Thomas than any man I've ever known. But you hold yourself apart, even here, even now." Victor was quiet for a long time. Outside, a winter storm was beginning, snow falling past the windows in thick flakes. Finally, he spoke. "Because I am a monster, Ilara. Not a metaphor, not a legend. I have lived for over 8 centuries. In that time, I have killed thousands. Some were enemies. Some were innocents who were simply in the wrong place. I have watched everyone I ever cared about turn to dust while I remain unchanged. I have committed acts that would make your hunters look like children playing at violence." He met her eyes. "So, I hold myself apart, because that is what monsters should do."
We should not pretend to be anything else. We should not delude ourselves into thinking we can have normal things: family, friendship, love. Ilara was quiet for a moment. Then she stood, walked over to him, and did something that no one in the castle would have dared. She placed her hand over his. His hand was cold, as all vampires' hands were, but it did not feel dead. It felt solid, real, present. "I was married once," Ilara said, softly. "Thomas's father. He was a good man by all accounts. Everyone in the village said so. And he beat me nearly every night, told me it was for my own good, to make me a better wife." Her hand tightened on Victor's. "One night, Thomas was 3 years old, and he tried to protect me. His father struck him so hard he couldn't hear properly for a week." Victor's hand turned over, engulfing hers. "What happened?" "I killed him." Ilara's voice was steady, matter-of-fact. "I put nightshade in his drink, watched him choke and die. And then I left, took Thomas, and never looked back." She looked directly at Victor. "So you see, I know something about being a monster, about doing terrible things. The difference is whether we let those things define us or whether we choose every day to be something more." "It's not the same." "Isn't it?" Ilara interrupted. "You've killed, yes, but in the 3 months I've been here, I've watched you govern fairly, make just decisions, show patience with a child who must drive you mad with questions. Train your guards to protect the vulnerable. You told Father Benedict that zealots have crossed lines, but you know where those lines are, Victor. You honor them. That's not a monster. That's a man who has lived long enough to learn wisdom." Victor stared at her,
This mortal woman who had somehow seen through 8 centuries of careful armor in just 3 months. You make it sound simple. It's not simple, but it is a choice. She squeezed his hand once, then let go. You can keep being the Vampire King alone on his throne.
Or you can be Victor, who has a friend in a healer and a 7-year-old boy who thinks you hung the moon. It's up to you. She returned to her workbench, leaving Victor sitting in stunned silence. The moment was broken by a sudden commotion from the hallway, running feet, urgent voices. Mikhail appeared in the doorway, his face grim. "Your Majesty, we have a situation." The situation, as Mikhail explained while they hurried through the castle corridors, was both simple and catastrophically complicated. A young woman had appeared at the castle gates, barely conscious, covered in blood. She carried the mark of the Crimson Court, a rival vampire faction from the south that had been encroaching on Draven territory for months. Before collapsing, she had gasped out a single message: "They're coming, the Purge, all of them." Now she lay in the great hall, attended by several of Victor's vampires, while guards scrambled to defensive positions throughout the castle. Victor entered to find Lady Sorina already examining the girl, who couldn't have been more than 19 when she was turned. "Report," Victor commanded. Sorina looked up, her face grave. "She's from Baron Corvinus's bloodline. She says the Crimson Court has allied with the Church. Father Benedict was just the beginning. They're marshalling an army. Hundreds of hunters, blessed weapons, and they have vampire traitors guiding them. They plan to strike at every major vampire holding simultaneously, wipe us out in one coordinated attack." "When?" Victor asked. 3 days, maybe 4. The hall erupted into urgent conversation. This was the nightmare scenario every vampire feared. A purge large enough and coordinated enough to actually threaten their existence. The last time the Church had mounted such an assault, 2 entire vampire bloodlines had been exterminated. "We should evacuate," one of the Lesser Lords said.
"Retreat to the deep caverns, wait them out." "And abandon our territory, our people?" Victor's voice cut through the panic like a blade. "No, we stand." "Your Majesty," Mikhail said carefully, "we have perhaps 60 vampires in fighting condition. Even if we recall the outlying patrols, that's 80 at most, against hundreds of trained hunters. Then we even the odds." Victor turned to the injured vampire. "You, what is your name?" "Irina, my lord. And why did Baron Corvinus send you to warn us? The Crimson Court hates House Draven." Irina struggled to sit up. "Because some of us remember what honor means. Because Baron Corvinus is dead. The traitors killed him when he refused to join their alliance. His last order was to warn you. He said, if anyone could stop this, it would be Victor Draven." Victor absorbed this, his mind already racing through strategies. "Mikhail, send riders to every vampire clan within 3 days' travel. Tell them we face extinction unless we unite. Old feuds end tonight. Anyone who answers the call will have full amnesty and a voice at my table." "And if they don't come?" Sorina asked. Victor's smile was sharp as broken glass. "Then we remind these hunters why our kind has survived from millennia. We show them what happens when you corner apex predators." He turned to leave, then paused. "Sorina, move the human servants to the deep vaults, full provisions. If we fall, they are to wait 3 days and then flee south to the free cities." "What about the Calloway woman and her child?" Sorina asked carefully. Victor's jaw tightened. "Them especially. They are under my personal protection. If I die, you will ensure they reach safety. Swear it." Serena bowed. "On my blood, my king." Victor found Ilara in the eastern tower, packing supplies with quick, efficient movements. Thomas sat on the bed, watching with wide eyes. They had clearly heard the commotion. "You're preparing to fight," Ilara said without preamble. "Yes."
"And you came to say goodbye." It wasn't a question. No. Victor closed the door behind him, and for a moment he let the weight of 8 centuries show on his face. "I came to ask you to do something impossibly brave once more." Ilara set down the bag she had been packing. "Tell me. I need you and Thomas in the deep vaults with the other mortals. If the battle goes poorly, Serena will evacuate you. There are provisions, gold, everything you need to reach the free cities and start over. And you? I will do what I have always done. Protect what is mine." Victor hesitated, then continued quietly. "You once asked me when I last let go of the weight I carry. The truth is, I don't remember. But tonight I realize I carry it because I choose to. Because there are things worth protecting. People worth dying for." Ilara crossed the room until she stood directly before him. "Then come back. Survive this. Because if you taught me anything in these 3 months, it's that monsters can choose to be heroes, and heroes can choose to live." Before Victor could respond, Thomas slipped off the bed and wrapped his arms around Victor's waist. The gesture was so unexpected, so guileless, that the ancient vampire stood frozen. "You have to win," Thomas said, his voice muffled against Victor's coat. "You're the best person I know, the bravest, and Mom and I need you." Something broke inside Victor's chest, some final wall he had been maintaining for centuries. He knelt down, meeting Thomas's eyes at his level. "I will do everything in my power to return," Victor said solemnly. "And if I cannot, then know this. You changed me, Thomas Calloway. Both of you. You reminded me why I became king in the first place. Not to rule through fear, but to protect those who cannot protect themselves." He stood, looking at Ilara one last time. There were words he wanted to say. Words about what her presence had meant, about how her simple friendship had begun to heal wounds he had thought permanent. But there was no time. "Go," he said instead. "Mikhail will take you to the vaults." As they left, Thomas turned back one last time. "King Victor, when you win, can we have a celebration? With cake?" Despite everything, Victor smiled. "With cake," he promised. The next 3 days passed in a blur of preparation. Riders returned bearing news both good and ill. Some vampire clans answered Victor's call, old rivals setting aside centuries of blood feuds because extinction respected no one's pride. Others sent only silence. By the 3rd night, Victor had assembled a force of 140 vampires. Not enough, not by half, but more than he had hoped. They fortified the castle, set traps, prepared for siege, and they waited. The hunters came at dawn, a deliberate insult, forcing the vampires to fight weakened by the rising sun. Victor watched from the battlements as the army appeared on the horizon. Hundreds of men in the dark armor of the Purge, carrying blessed silver and torches, chanting prayers that echoed across the valley like thunder. At their head rode a figure in white, Father Augustine, the Archbishop of the Crusade. And beside him, to Victor's cold fury, rode several vampires bearing the mark of traitors. "So this is how we die," Mikhail said quietly, "betrayed by our own kind." "No," Victor said, drawing his sword, "ancient steel forged in an age when kingdoms were young. This is how we remind the world who we are." He turned to face his assembled force. Vampires from a dozen bloodlines, some of whom had been killing each other just days ago, now stood united.
In the courtyard below, Lady Serena had woven her greatest illusion. The castle appeared to have only a skeleton crew, with most of the windows dark. Let the hunters think them already defeated. Today, Victor called out, his voice carrying to every vampire in the castle, we face extinction. The hunters believe they have already won. They believe we are fractured, weak, afraid.
They believe we will break like we did a century ago. He paused, letting his words sink in. They are wrong. Today, we show them what it means to truly hunt. Today, we teach them that vampires do not fade quietly into history. And today, we prove that even monsters can have something worth dying for. The roar that answered him shook the very stones of the castle. The first wave of hunters hit the outer walls at full dawn. They came with ladders, battering rams, holy water catapults. The vampires met them with steel and fury, fighting despite the weakness the sun brought. Victor was everywhere at once, on the walls, in the courtyard, wherever the battle was thickest. He moved like death itself, his blade singing through the air, cutting down hunters with the precision of centuries of combat experience. But for every hunter that fell, 2 more took their place. The sheer numbers were overwhelming. "Fall back!" Mikhail shouted from the eastern wall. "Fall back to the inner keep!" It was the plan. Let the hunters think they were winning. Draw them deep into the castle, where Serena's illusions and carefully placed traps would even the odds. The vampires retreated in good order, leaving the outer walls to the invaders. The hunters poured through the gates, their war cries echoing off the stone. They spread through the courtyards, the lower halls, confident in their victory. Then the trap sprang. Serena's illusions fell away, revealing that the empty rooms were filled with vampires. The abandoned halls had false floors that dropped hunters into silver-spiked pits. The deserted armory exploded when a hunter's torch touched it, taking out 24 men in flames and shrapnel. The tide turned. Victor found Father Augustine in the throne room. The priest had fought his way there specifically, believing that killing the king would end the resistance. He stood before the empty throne, his blessed sword raised, chanting his prayers. "Your prayers fall on deaf ears here," Victor said, stepping out of the shadows. "Your God has no dominion in the house of the damned." Augustine spun, his face twisted with righteous fury. "Demon, your reign of darkness ends today. I will mount your head on the steps of the cathedral and—" He attacked mid-sentence, his blade moving with surprising speed for a mortal. Victor parried, their swords clashing with a sound like bells. They fought through the throne room, across the dais, up and down the steps. Augustine was skilled, perhaps the best swordsman Victor had faced in decades. But Victor had been fighting longer than the priest's entire nation had existed. "Tell me," Victor said, dodging a thrust and countering with a slash that opened Augustine's shoulder. "Do you even know why you hunt us? Beyond the scripture, beyond the dogma. You are abominations!" Augustine gasped, clutching his wound. "You steal lives! You corrupt the innocent! You exist," Victor finished. "We exist, and that terrifies you, because it means your worldview is too simple. There is no perfect good and evil, Augustine. There are only choices. And you chose genocide." He disarmed the priest with a flick of his wrist, sending the blessed sword clattering across the floor. Then he pressed his own blade to Augustine's throat. "I could kill you," Victor said quietly. "I have every right. You came to my home, slaughtered my people, tried to wipe out my entire species.
But I won't. Do you know why? Augustine stared at him, uncomprehending. Because 7 months ago, a child taught me that mercy matters, that deaths are sacred, that even monsters can choose to be more. Victor lowered his sword. So here is my mercy. You will leave. You will tell your church that the age of purges is over. Any future attacks on vampires will be met not with defense, but with retaliation. We will burn your cathedrals. We will scatter your armies.
We will show you what happens when the monsters stop being merciful. He leaned in close. But we will not strike first, because that child also taught me that being more than a monster means choosing restraint. Remember that, Augustine. Remember who showed mercy when they had every reason not to. He called for guards, who dragged the priest away. Around him, the sounds of battle were fading. The hunters were retreating, their forces broken, their confidence shattered. The vampire traitors had been captured or killed. Against all odds, Castle Draven had held. Victor stood alone in his throne room, covered in blood, exhausted in ways that went beyond the physical. Then he heard footsteps, small, running footsteps that he had been forbidden to hear in this room ever again. Thomas burst through the doors, Ilara running behind him, trying and failing to hold him back. "You won!" Thomas shouted, launching himself at Victor. This time, Victor caught him, lifting the child into his arms. "I thought I gave orders about the throne room," he said, but there was no anger in his voice. "I know," Thomas said, grinning unrepentantly, "but this was an emergency. We had to make sure you were okay." Ilara reached them, her face flushed with exertion and relief. "I couldn't stop him. He was convinced." She stopped, looking at Victor. Really looking at him. "You're hurt. It will heal. Maybe faster with proper treatment." She smiled. "Come, let me practice my healing on you." As they left the throne room, Victor carrying Thomas, Ilara walking beside them, the surviving vampires watched in stunned silence. Their king, the ancient terror, walking peacefully with mortals like a family returning home from an outing. Lady Serena appeared at Mikhail's side. "Things have changed," she observed. "Yes," Mikhail agreed. "The question is, for better or worse?" Serena watched Victor laugh at something Thomas said, saw Ilara's hand rest naturally on the king's arm.
"I think," she said slowly, "that remains to be seen. But I will admit, I have not seen him this alive in 2 centuries. The weeks following the battle brought profound changes to Castle Draven. The vampire clans that had answered Victor's call did not immediately leave. Instead, they stayed to negotiate a new accord. The old feuds and territorial disputes that had divided vampire kind for centuries were set aside in favor of a united front. Victor established the Council of Night, a parliament of sorts, where vampire lords could settle disputes through words rather than blood. The humans who served the castle came out of hiding to find their home still standing, their king victorious. The story of Victor's mercy toward Father Augustine spread, carried by survivors of the battle. It painted a different picture of the vampire king, not a mindless monster, but a leader capable of strategy, honor, and, yes, even compassion. Not everyone approved. One evening, a month after the battle, Lady Serena requested an audience. Victor granted it, meeting her in his study rather than the throne room, a small but significant informality that had become more common. "You've become soft," Serena said without preamble. "The court talks, They say the mortal woman has bewitched you, that you've forgotten what we are." Victor set down the treaty he had been reviewing. "And what do you say, Serena?" The ancient vampire was quiet for a moment. "I say that you are different. Whether that is soft or evolved, I have not yet decided." She moved to the window, looking out over the moonlit grounds. "But I will tell you what I observed during the battle. I saw vampires who had been killing each other for centuries fight side by side because you asked them to. I saw hunters retreat in terror, not because we were monsters, but because we fought with coordination and purpose. And I saw Father Augustine leave here more afraid of your mercy than he ever was of your violence." She turned back to him. "That is not weakness, Victor. That is something we have not had in a very long time. That is leadership that extends beyond fear." "But," Victor prompted, hearing the unspoken word, "but leadership requires balance. You cannot forget what we are in your effort to prove we can be more. We are predators. We drink blood. We kill to survive. No amount of kindness from one mortal woman changes that fundamental truth." "I haven't forgotten," Victor said quietly. "Believe me, Serena, I am reminded of it every time I see Thomas. Every time I remember how easy it would be to hurt them, how fragile they are. That is precisely why their presence matters, because it requires constant vigilance, constant choice. It keeps us sharp in ways that simply being feared never did." Serena studied him for a long moment. "Very well, I trust your judgment. But know this, not all of the court agrees with me. There are those who see the Calloways as a weakness to exploit. You should be careful." "Let them try," Victor said, and there was enough steel in his voice that Serena smiled. "There is the king I know. Just don't lose him entirely to domesticity." The threat Serena warned about came sooner than expected. 2 nights later, Victor was working late in his study when he heard a scream. Ilara's voice, coming from the healing room. He moved faster than thought, arriving to find Ilara backed against the wall, Thomas behind her, while a vampire Victor didn't immediately recognize on them. The vampire was young, perhaps 50 years turned, and his eyes were wild with hunger. "She smells so sweet," he was saying, almost to himself. "Just a taste, just a little taste. The king won't mind. He has plenty of humans." Victor's hand closed around the vampire's throat, lifting him off the ground and slamming him against the stone wall hard enough to crack it. "What did you say?" Victor's voice was soft, deadly calm. "I don't believe I heard you correctly." The young vampire struggled, but Victor's grip was iron. I'm sorry, my lord. I was just—" "You were just about to violate the most sacred law of this castle. You were about to harm someone under my personal protection, someone who has been declared untouchable by my direct command." Victor's eyes began to glow, red light filling the room. "Give me one reason why I shouldn't end you right now." "Please," the vampire gasped. "I'm young. I was hungry. I made a mistake." "Mistakes have consequences." Victor dropped him, then drew a silver dagger from his belt. "You have 2 choices. You can face formal execution tomorrow in front of the court, so everyone understands what happens to those who break my laws. Or you can leave this castle tonight, right now, and never return. You will be declared outlaw. Any vampire may hunt you without consequence. No clan will harbor you. You will be truly alone." The young vampire looked between the dagger and the door. I'll leave. Please, I leave. Then go. If I ever see you again, I will not be so merciful. The vampire fled. Victor watched him go, then turned to Ilara and Thomas. Are you hurt? No, Ilara said, still shaky but composed. You arrived in time. Thomas, however, was not crying. He was angry. That wasn't fair, he said, his small hands balled into fists. We didn't do anything wrong. Why did he try to hurt us? Victor knelt down to the boy's level. Because he let his hunger control him instead of controlling his hunger. Because he forgot that being strong means protecting the weak, not preying on them. He put a hand on Thomas' shoulder. I am sorry. I promised you would be safe here. We are safe, Thomas said firmly, because you protect us. But, he hesitated, King Victor, can you teach me to protect us too, when I'm older? The question caught Victor off guard. Teach you? To fight, to be brave like you. Thomas looked up at him with absolute trust. So if you're not there, I can protect Mom. Ilara started to object, but Victor held up a hand. How old are you, Thomas? 8, almost 8. When you are 10, if you still want to learn, if your mother approves, I will teach you myself. Not to fight like a vampire, but to fight like a human who refuses to be a victim. Is that acceptable? Thomas's face lit up. Really? Really. But until then, you focus on your studies. Agreed? Agreed! After Thomas ran off to tell Mikhail about his future training, Ilara remained. She crossed to Victor, and he expected her to thank him or to express her fear about what had happened. Instead, she slapped him. Not hard, she was mortal after all, but hard enough to shock him. That, Ilara said fiercely, was for letting that creature get so close before you intervened. I know you heard us sooner. I know you were testing something. Victor rubbed his cheek, more surprised than hurt. You're right. I wanted to see if he would actually attack or if he would restrain himself. I needed to know which of my vampires could be trusted. You needed to know? We aren't experiments, Victor. We're people. If you're going to protect us, then protect us. Don't use us as bait to test your court's loyalty. The anger in her voice was matched by the fear underneath it, not fear of the vampire who had threatened her, but fear of the one standing before her, fear of what he was capable of, what he might do without thinking about the human cost. Victor felt the truth of her words like a physical blow. You're right, he said quietly. I apologize. I have been isolated for so long that I sometimes forget people are not chess pieces. You are not tools to be used for greater purposes. You are. What? Ilara asked, her anger fading into something more complicated. What are we to you, Victor? It was the question he had been avoiding for months, the question that terrified him more than any army of hunters. You are proof, he finally said, that I can be more than what I have been. Thomas is hope that the future can be different from the past. And you, he met her eyes, you are the friend I have not had in 3 centuries. The conscience I had forgotten I possessed. The mirror that shows me which version of myself I want to become. Ilara was quiet for a long moment. Then, gently, she took his hand. Then be that version. Not perfectly, not all at once, but choose it every day. The way you did tonight when you showed mercy instead of executing that vampire immediately. He deserved execution, Victor said. Maybe. But you gave him a chance to change. That's what matters. She squeezed his hand once, then let go. Now, I should check on Thomas. He'll be too excited to sleep, but I should at least try. As she left, Victor stood alone in the healing room, looking at his hand.
The hand she had held without fear, despite everything, despite what he was. Lady Serena's words echoed in his mind. Don't lose yourself to domesticity. But perhaps, Victor thought, being lost was not always a bad thing. Perhaps some things were worth losing yourself in. 6 months after the battle, Victor called a gathering of the Council of Night. Representatives from every vampire clan that had answered his call attended, along with several who had not, but now sought to join the alliance. The great hall was filled with immortals, their ancient eyes watching their king with a mixture of respect, fear, and curiosity. Victor stood before them, not on his throne, but on the floor level. Another small but significant break from tradition. "We have survived," he began, "against an army that should have destroyed us, against betrayal from within our own ranks, against the full fury of the Church's purge. We survived because we united, because old enemies became new allies, because we proved that vampire kind is stronger together than divided."
Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. "But survival is not enough," Victor continued. "We cannot simply wait for the next purge, the next war, the next existential threat. We must change. We must evolve. Not in our nature, we will always be what we are, but in how we exist in this world." "What do you propose?" Baron Corvinus's successor asked. "A new age," Victor said. "An age where we stop hiding in the shadows, waiting to be hunted. An age where we establish real territories with real laws that even humans can understand. Where we trade with human cities instead of raiding them. Where we become predictable and therefore less frightening." "You want us to make peace with mortals?" Lady Anastasia, one of the elder vampires, laughed bitterly. "Not all of them," Victor agreed, "but some will. The pragmatic ones. The ones who realize that trading with vampires is more profitable than fighting them. The ones who see advantage in alliance." He paused. "We will always have enemies, but we can choose to have fewer of them." "This is madness," another vampire said. "We are predators. They are prey. That is the natural order." "The natural order," Victor countered, "has nearly led to our extinction twice in the last century alone. Perhaps it is time for a new order." The debate raged for hours. Some vampires embraced Victor's vision. Others rejected it utterly. But in the end, enough agreed to make a difference. The council passed Victor's reforms, establishing formal vampire territories with recognized borders, creating laws governing human-vampire interactions, and setting up trade agreements with several human cities desperate enough or pragmatic enough to deal with immortals. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't even close to perfect. But it was a start. As the gathering dispersed, Lady Serena approached Victor. "You realize you've just set in motion changes that will take decades to fully implement?" "Yes," Victor said. "Which means I need to be around to see them through." "That sounds almost like you found a reason to continue existing beyond mere obligation." Victor smiled, an expression that would have shocked the court just months ago. "Perhaps I have." 1 year after Thomas first burst into his throne room, Victor found himself doing something he had not done in over 3 centuries, attending a birthday celebration. Thomas was turning 8, and Alara had insisted on throwing a proper party. The eastern courtyard had been decorated with streamers and lanterns. The kitchen had produced an actual cake, something the vampire cooks had needed to research, as they had no idea how to make food for mortals anymore. A handful of human servants' children had been invited, along with several young vampires from various clans who were curious about this strange hybrid celebration. Elder Cassius attended, grumbling about the frivolity, but secretly pleased to see his students so happy. Even Lady Serena made an appearance, watching the proceedings with amused tolerance. Victor stood to the side, observing. He had brought a gift, a small sword, perfectly balanced for a child, made of regular steel rather than silver. When Thomas opened it, his eyes went wide with wonder. "Is this really mine?" he asked. "It is," Victor confirmed, "though you won't be using it for 2 more years, when you begin your training. Consider it an investment in your future." Thomas hugged him, an action that still caught Victor off guard every time, though he was getting better at returning the gesture. As the party continued, Alara joined Victor at his observation post. She looked happy, more relaxed than he had ever seen her. "Thank you," she said, "for all of this, for letting us build a life here." "You have given me far more than I have given you," Victor replied. "You have given me purpose beyond mere survival." Ilara was quiet for a moment, watching Thomas play with the other children, human and vampire mixing with surprisingly little awkwardness. "He's going to grow up," she said softly, "become a man, have his own life. And I'm going to grow old. Eventually, I'll die. We both will." "I know. Does that frighten you, getting close to mortals, knowing you'll lose them?" Victor considered the question carefully. "Yes," he admitted, "it terrifies me. I have spent centuries avoiding exactly that pain. But I have also spent centuries alone, and that is its own kind of death." He looked at her. "I would rather have your friendship for whatever time you have than spend another 3 centuries with nothing but loneliness and duty." Ilara smiled, but there was sadness in it. "You know, if you wanted, there are ways to extend a moral life. I've heard stories of vampires sharing blood, creating thralls." "No." Victor's response was immediate and firm. "I will not bind you to me that way. You deserve to live as you choose, to die when your time comes naturally. I will not steal that from you, no matter how much I might wish to keep you here longer. Even though it means you'll be alone again? Even then." He met her eyes. "You taught me that monsters can choose to be more. Part of being more means respecting the choices and autonomy of others, even when it hurts, especially when it hurts." Ilara reached up and kissed his cheek, a gentle, platonic gesture that nevertheless made several vampires turn and stare. "You're a good man, Victor Draven. I hope you finally believe that." Before Victor could respond, Thomas ran up, dragging a young vampire girl behind him. "King Victor, this is Helena. She says her dad is teaching her to track deer. Can she show me, please?" Victor looked at the vampire child, perhaps 12 when she was turned, now approaching her 1st century. "If Lady Anastasia approves," Victor said, nodding to the girl's mother, "and if you stay within the castle grounds and take a guard." "We will," Thomas promised, already running off with his new friend. "That boy is going to give me gray hair," Ilara muttered. "If it helps," Victor offered, "he gives me gray hair too, and I'm immortal." Ilara laughed, a sound that had become increasingly common in the halls of Castle Draven over the past year. As the party continued into the evening, Victor found himself thinking about the future in a way he never had before. For centuries he had existed, day to day, year to year, with no particular goal beyond survival and duty. But now there were birthday parties to attend, treaties to negotiate, a boy to train in 2 years, a healer whose friendship had become essential, a castle full of vampires slowly learning that being predators did not preclude being people. It was terrifying and hopeful in equal measure. As the sun began to set, a sight Victor could only glimpse through heavily shaded windows, he made a decision. Tomorrow, he would begin writing a new code of laws for the vampire territories. Not laws based on fear and dominance, but on the principles he had learned from the most unlikely of teachers. a widow and her son who had dared to ask a monster for help. Tonight, though, he would simply enjoy this moment. The laughter of children, the warmth of friendship, the possibility that even after 8 centuries he could still change. "Your Majesty," Mikhail approached, formal as always, even in the relaxed atmosphere. "There are documents that require your attention. The trade agreement with the southern merchants." "Tomorrow," Victor interrupted gently. "Tonight I am not the vampire king. Tonight I am simply Victor, attending a friend's son's birthday party." Mikhail blinked, clearly surprised, then bowed. "As you wish, my lord." As his captain left, Lady Serena appeared at Victor's elbow. "You've gone completely soft," she observed, but there was no criticism in her tone. "Perhaps," Victor agreed. "Or perhaps I've simply remembered what it means to live rather than merely exist. And if another threat comes, another army, another betrayal?" Victor's expression hardened just slightly, a reminder that beneath the friend and mentor was still an 8-century-old apex predator. Then they will discover that being more than a monster does not mean being less dangerous. It simply means choosing when and how to be dangerous. Serena smiled. "Good, because you're right. We do need to change, but we also need to remember what we are. Balance, Victor. That's what you found. That's what will keep us alive." She drifted away to speak with other guests, leaving Victor alone with his thoughts. Balance. Yes, that was it. Not abandoning his nature, but choosing how to express it. Not forgetting what he was capable of, but being selective about when to unleash it. Being strong enough to be gentle. Being dangerous enough that mercy meant something. Thomas ran past again, laughing with Helena and 2 human children, chasing something only they could see. Ilara was speaking with Elder Cassius, probably discussing Thomas's curriculum. The vampire lords and ladies mingled with human servants, not as predators and prey, but as, well, perhaps not friends, but not enemies either. It was imperfect. It was fragile. It would require constant work to maintain. It was, Victor realized, exactly what he had been missing for 3 centuries. 2 years later, on Thomas's 10th birthday, Victor kept his promise. In the training yard, before an audience of curious vampires and nervous humans, he presented Thomas with the sword he had given him 2 years prior. "Today," Victor announced, "you begin your training. Not to be a vampire, not to be a hunter, but to be a warrior who fights for what he believes in, who protects those who cannot protect themselves. Who understands that true strength comes not from power, but from the choice to use that power wisely." Thomas accepted the sword with shaking hands, overwhelmed by the formality and attention. "We begin tomorrow at dawn," Victor continued. "I will not be easy on you. I will not coddle you, but I will teach you everything I know about combat, strategy, and honor. Are you prepared?" "Yes, my king," Thomas said, his voice cracking with emotion and prepubescence. "Good." Victor allowed himself a small smile. "Then go enjoy your party. Tomorrow, the real work begins." As Thomas ran off, Ilara approached. She was 31 now, with the first hints of silver in her dark hair. Time was marching on, as it always did for mortals. "Thank you," she said, "for taking him seriously, for treating his request with respect." "He earned it by being patient for 2 years," Victor replied. "Besides, I find I am looking forward to teaching him. It has been a long time since I took a student." "Just don't turn him into a miniature vampire king," Ilara said with a laugh. "I wouldn't dream of it. One is quite enough." Victor paused, then added quietly, "How are you feeling? Truly?" Ilara touched her side almost unconsciously, a gesture Victor had noticed her making more frequently. "I'm fine. Just a persistent cough. It's nothing." But Victor, who had lived 8 centuries and seen every manner of illness, heard the lie. He said nothing, though. If Ilara wanted to keep it from him, from Thomas, she had that right. Instead, he simply said, "If you need anything, anything at all, I hope you know you need only ask." Ilara met his eyes, and in that moment, he knew that she knew that he knew. But she smiled anyway. "I know. Thank you, Victor." The seasons turned. Thomas trained every morning with Victor, learning sword forms and tactics, strategy and ethics. He grew taller, stronger, more confident. The shy, frightened child who had burst into the throne room was becoming a capable young man. Ilara's cough grew worse. She tried to hide it, tried to keep working, but eventually she had to admit she needed rest. Victor had his physicians, both vampire and the few human doctors he could trust, examine her. The diagnosis was what he had feared, a wasting sickness in her lungs. Treatable, to a point, but ultimately fatal. She had perhaps 2 years, maybe 3 if she was lucky. Victor took the news with the stoic calm of someone who had lost countless people over the centuries, but inside, in a place he thought had died long ago, he raged against the unfairness of it. That this woman, who had survived an abusive husband and narrowly escaped burning alive, who had built a life in a vampire's castle and became his dearest friend, should die from simple illness. He offered her the blood, the gift of immortality. She refused. "I will not become what you are," she said gently, sitting in her room in the Eastern Tower, the same room she had occupied for 3 years now. "Not because there's anything wrong with it, but because it's not my path. I have lived as a human. I will die as one." "Even though it means leaving Thomas?" Victor asked, unable to keep the pain from his voice. "Thomas is 13 now, nearly a man. He has you, he has Cassius, he has a home and a purpose." She smiled sadly. "I have been luckier than most mothers, Victor. I got to see my son grow up safe and happy. How many people can say that?" "It isn't enough time," Victor said, and he was no longer talking about her. Ilara reached out and took his hand. Her fingers were thinner than they had been, her skin more translucent. Time and illness doing what no hunter ever could, making her fragile. "It never is," she agreed, "but we don't get to choose how much time we have, only what we do with it." She squeezed his hand. "You've become a true friend, Victor." "More than that, you've become the man I always suspected you could be. Kind, just, strong enough to be gentle. Don't lose that when I'm gone. Promise me." "I promise," Victor said, and meant it. Ilara Calloway died on a spring morning, with Thomas holding one hand and Victor holding the other. She went peacefully, in no pain, surrounded by people who loved her. Thomas wept. Victor, who could not cry even if he wished to, simply sat beside the bed in silence, holding the hand of his friend until it grew cold. The funeral was attended by humans and vampires alike, an unthinkable sight just 5 years earlier. They buried her in the castle gardens, under an oak tree where sunlight fell in the mornings and moonlight at night. Thomas read a eulogy he had written himself. Victor said nothing, but he stood at the graveside long after everyone else had left. "I don't know if you can hear me," he said to the fresh earth. "I don't know if there is anything beyond death for mortals. But if there is, I hope you know what you gave me. You gave me proof that change is possible, that monsters can become more, that friendship can exist between the most unlikely of people." He was quiet for a long moment. "I will watch over Thomas," he continued. "I will teach him everything I promised. I will make sure he becomes the man you dreamed he could be. That is my new debt, Alara, and I will not forget it." A hand touched his shoulder. Thomas, who had come back despite his grief. The boy was nearly as tall as Victor now, still growing. "She loved you, you know," Thomas said quietly, "as a friend. She told me so. She said you saved us twice, once from the hunters and once from despair." Victor looked at this boy, no, this young man, who had changed everything by daring to ask a monster for help. "She saved me as well," Victor said, "more than she ever knew." They stood there together, the Vampire King and the mortal boy, mourning the woman who had brought them together. Finally, Thomas spoke again. "Will you keep training me? I know with Mom gone you might want to—" "I gave my word," Victor interrupted firmly, "and your mother made me promise to see you become the man she knew you could be. So yes, Thomas, we continue. Tomorrow morning, as always." Thomas nodded, wiping his eyes. "Thank you for everything, for being— I don't know what to call you. You're not my father, but you're more than just my teacher." Victor considered this. "Call me what you wish. Names matter less than the relationship behind them." "Then I'll call you Victor," Thomas decided. "Just Victor, my friend who happens to be a vampire king." Despite his grief, Victor smiled. "That will do quite nicely." The Twilight Wardens, those who stand between the human world and the supernatural, not as hunters or as thralls, but as allies and guardians. You will be the bridge between our peoples, Thomas, the proof that cooperation is possible. Will you accept this duty?" Thomas took the sword, his hands steady. "I will. I swear on my mother's memory and by the friendship that has sustained me, I will serve with honor, protect the innocent of both races, and work toward a future where we no longer fear each other." The assembled witnesses, vampire and human, applauded. It was a new beginning, the fruit of 8 years of careful change and difficult choices. That evening, Victor found Thomas on the battlements, looking out over the valley. The young man had his new sword at his side, and there was a thoughtfulness to his expression. "Having second thoughts?" Victor asked, joining him. "No, just thinking about Mom, wishing she could have seen this." "I believe she can," Victor said quietly, "and I believe she would be tremendously proud." They stood in comfortable silence for a while. Finally, Thomas spoke again. "What happens now? I'm a Twilight Warden, but I'm the only one. How do we build something from just me?" "The same way we built everything else," Victor replied. "One choice at a time, one person at a time. You will travel. You will help people, both human and vampire. You will show them that cooperation is possible. Others will see your example and follow. And you? I will continue ruling, continue changing our laws, our society, continue the work your mother and I began." Victor smiled slightly. "And I will always have a place for you here, Thomas. This is your home as much as it is mine." Thomas nodded. "I think I'd like to travel, see the world, help where I can. But," he hesitated, "I'll come back, regularly, to report, to train, to just visit. I would like that very much." They watched the sun set together, Thomas openly, Victor through heavily tinted glass. As darkness fell and the first stars appeared, Thomas asked one final question. "Do you think it's enough? Everything we've done, everything we're trying to do, is it enough to change the world?" Victor thought about a crying child who had burst through his doors 8 years ago, about a healer who had taught him the difference between existing and living, about the slow, difficult work of building alliances and changing laws, about the Council of Night that now governed vampire territories with actual justice rather than mere force, about the human cities that traded peacefully with supernatural beings, about all the small victories that added up to something larger. "No," he said honestly, "it's not enough to change the world. Not yet. But it's enough to start. And sometimes that's all we can do. Plant the seeds and hope they grow." Thomas grinned, an expression so like his mother's that Victor felt the familiar ache of her absence. "Then let's plant a lot of seeds." "Agreed," Victor said. "Now, come. Lady Serena has organized a celebration in your honor, and you know how insulted she gets if people are late to her parties." As they left the battlements together, Victor allowed himself a moment of satisfaction. 8 years ago, he had been a monster on a throne, alone and purposeless. Now he was a king with friends, a mentor with a student, an immortal with actual hope for the future. It wasn't perfect. There were still hunters who killed vampires on sight, still vampires who saw humans as nothing but food, still 1,000 problems to solve. But the impossible had happened. 2 species that had been at war for millennia had begun, just barely begun, to find common ground. And it had all started with a little boy running into a throne room, crying for help. Victor smiled as he descended the stairs. Sometimes, he thought, the greatest changes come from the smallest acts of courage, and sometimes even monsters can learn to be more, as long as someone is brave enough to ask.